This is October the 2nd, 2013, and the venue is the Clayton Thousand Island Museum, located at 312 James Street, Clayton, New York. And the presentation that I originally made was done in July of this year, and basically talking about the Zenda Farms and the owner of Zenda Farms, Merle Youngs. I was introduced on that date in July by Debbie Dermody, who is the volunteer coordinator of History at Noon, a program that is sponsored by the museum here, and it has been very successful in helping to preserve some of our local history. And she introduced me that day as Bob Kittle, born in Clayton, went to school here in Clayton, went into the Navy, graduated from Cornell, married Beverly McKinley, had 3 children, and that is basically, and became manager of Zenda Farms in 1958. That'll come later. That's my life in just about one sentence, I guess. The gentleman that we're talking about is, I have a picture of him right here that I'll show you, and then we'll put it away because it's kind of haunting, because he won't let me not tell the truth, and if I did, I'm sure he'd jump right out of the picture and grab me. Mr. Youngs was, and I will refer to Mr. Youngs through this presentation as Mr. Youngs, and he was born Merle Youngs in Tully, not Tully, New York, Freeville, New York, which is between Cortland and Ithaca, New York. And he was born on the 2nd of December, 1986. Mr. Youngs had 2 brothers, Arthur Youngs and Carrie Youngs. And Arthur Youngs became part of his business as time went on. Mr. Youngs was educated, of course, in his hometown of Freeville, and he went on to be educated at Rochester Business Institute in, I don't know what years, but that's not really important. But I do know that after graduating from RBI, he went to work for a drug company in New York City by the name of R.J. Pierce. At the time of my presentation in July, I did not know this, that the drug company that he went to work for was owned by his cousin. And one of his first jobs was to go to Germany and purchase drugs. Basically, the drug that he was purchasing was aspirin. And upon returning to New York, he went into the office, and they asked him how he did, and he told them he thought he did all right. And he told them that he bought 3 carloads of aspirin, and I guess that was a very large quantity at the time. And so he was asked what the heck he was going to do with these 3 carloads of aspirin, and he said, "I'm going to sell them." And so anyway, he got on the train, and he told me this, that by the time he got to St. Louis, he had the 3 carloads of aspirin sold, and that made his employer, his cousin, a very large fortune. I might just add, why did he go to Germany? At that time, this would have been probably in the early 1900s. All our chemical production was basically done in Germany. I'm not just sure when Mr. Youngs left his employment there and when he started into the prophylactic business, but the best I can date it is right around the early 1920s after World War I. And I confirmed this with his nephew, Gordon Youngs, who would be his brother, Arthur Youngs' son. And the prophylactic business at that time, as we all know, was kind of an under-the-counter sort of business, and it was his goal to bring this out to be a very legitimate business, and he did it basically through selling exclusively to drugstores. And in fact, on the early packages of prophylactics, it said sold exclusively through drugstores, and he got the support of all the druggists that way. Mr. Youngs was basically the sales end of the organization, and his brother Arthur was the manufacturing end. And the New York was the sales office, and Trenton, New Jersey was the manufacturing. And brother Arthur was very, very innovative in doing some of the processing of the condoms, and he introduced the electronic testing method so that every condom was electronically tested and was the quality assurance was there. There was a fire in Trenton in the early 20s in the manufacturing, and this was probably a godsend because it made them renovate their plant and they got really updated. Merle, Mr. Youngs, he came to Clayton probably in the early 30s, and probably the river is what drew him here, even though he had two hobbies: boating, sailing namely, and farming. And the first property he bought was in the Bartlett Point area known as Prospect Park. And while he was there, he was one of the founders of the Clayton Yacht Club and a big supporter of the Clayton Yacht Club. He owned a piece of property, or the property that he owned was known as the Birches. Well, in 1939, the property became for sale next door to him, which was known as the Zenda, and that was owned previously by James Hackett, who was an actor in the Prisoner of Zenda. And Mr. Hackett, I have his dates of birth somewhere. He purchased the Zenda in 1950, and he died in 1926. Mr. Hackett did. And Mr. Youngs bought the adjacent property to the main Zenda in 1940 and started his farming operation. He continually added property to the point where he ended up with 800 acres of continuous property along the Clayton K. Vincent Road in Frontenac, Crystal Springs. His brother Arthur also had a farm. I gather, being farm boys, they both, that was their hobby then, and they both had Guernsey cattle, and they were always competing, especially in producing the best quality of milk that they could produce. In order to get the license to deliver milk here in the village of Clayton, he had to purchase one of the farms had a license, and so that's how he got to be able to deliver the milk. And he built a set of farm buildings. James Way built the buildings, and there's a story that goes with the James buildings. They're metal buildings, and I always thought that that was the name of a company, James Way. But after a gentleman by the name of Ted Mascott doing extensive research, he found out that the James Way comes from a gentleman by the name of William James, who was a innovator in dairy products, and one of the big products was the stanchion that holds cows in the barn. He observed in the previous years that it wasn't very comfortable for a cow to go into a stanchion and just be there very rigid, and so he innovated the stanchion so that it had a lot of movement and swinging. And he also was innovative in developing the gutter cleaner and just many. But the James Way part comes in as it was doing it the James Way, and that's how the James Way came about. Mr. Young's, they supplied milk to the village here, and they supplied to the school. And I have a Jill bottle here someplace that he delivered milk to school, and that was before plastic or anything like that. And this milk that was delivered to the village here, Mr. Young's told me this, personally told me this, that it cost him $4 a quart to produce the milk, and he was selling it for 10 cents a quart. So anyway, he did have a lot of trouble. He didn't have trouble, but he had problems with internal revenue, because the way the farm laws became, you had to make money every 5 years, or you couldn't take the deduction, and so it just became not profitable for him to be running this, and his dairy herd was well known all over the United States, and he had purchased many of his foundation cattle from farms like Douglas and Manor Farms and Plasky and Tarbell Farms. And anyway, that ran its course, and I've got one other story I want to tell. He and his brother, being competitive, both having cattle different locations, and the quality of the way they judged their quality was by bacteria count. And the barns were all equipped with electric screens, and the cattle were washed daily, and they got milk down so low in bacteria count that it did not even taste like milk. In fact, Mr. Young said that his brother made up a poultice he took some cow manure and he dried it and put it made it look like a tea bag and dipped it into milk and gave it to some of his employees, and they agreed that tasted like milk. So anyway, Mr. Young's was looking for a place while he had the farm, while he had the Guernsey cattle to grow his heifers. So Carlton Island became for sale about 10 miles up the road towards Cape Vincent, and he purchased Carlton Island in 1943. Carlton Island was previously owned by General Electric Company, and it was supposed to be a retreat for all the executives. There was 1,272 acres in Carlton Island, and General Electric was going to have, they had 2 golf courses laid out and a hotel setting and airport and the whole 9 yards. And General Electric laid cable, both electric and telephone cable to the island. And so when it became for sale, again, this 1,272 acres and farm buildings, etc., and the purchase price was $14,000, and I have copies of that in my files of the purchase offer and what have you. So it's very authentic. Thank you. He raised some of his dairy heifers there, but the dairy business, he just decided to get out of the dairy business. And in 1937, I believe, he had a dispersal sale of his cattle, and he had 10 animals, real top-notch animals with great records. They sold, and there was a newspaper article said that those 100 and some cows sold for $31,000 plus, which in today's cattle prices is not very much. And when he sold his dairy cattle off, he did Graves Brothers, and with the intent that they were going to run the farm, buy the farm, run the farm, and they took over the milk route that Zenda Farms had in the village and school. And there was a big to-do at the time about being able to switch over from using the same equipment like bottles, but they did get permission through the FDA or the health authorities to use the bottles. But Graves Brothers just couldn't make it. It was just too much for them to swing, and the farm diverted back to Mr. Young's, and that is when he decided to switch to beef. And he started out with just a small herd purchased from, well, he got I believe from Kansas or someplace. He had a carload of cattle come in, and he purchased some of his better breeding stock, like the bulls and what have you, from the local New York State Hereford Association. And he built his numbers up very fast. I forgot to mention one big thing, and that is the management. The management, a gentleman by the name of Mr. Muldoon, Clayton Muldoon. He came on the scene in about 1943, 4, something like that. He was a high school agricultural teacher, and he went in the employment of Mr. Young's, and he is really the result of what Zenda Farms became. He was an icon in his field, and the way Mr. Young's managed, what I'll get into, as manager, you had free run of everything. And anyway, Mr. Muldoon just made the farms what they are today. He was my mentor also. The sad thing was, in 1958, Mr. Muldoon was on a bull buying trip in Virginia, and he had a heart attack, and he passed away. And at that time, I was working in Chicago, the Swift & Company, in a research department there, and it dawned on me about a month later that I wondered if Mr. Youngs had ever hired anybody to replace Mr. Muldoon. And I went home to lunch that day and went to talk with my wife, and I posed the same question. I said, would you be interested in moving back home? Well, needless to say what the answer was there. And I called up Mr. Youngs and I told him I would be interested, and he told me he was interviewing people continually, and if I were home some time, I just stop up. And so needless to say again that Friday Beverly and I were home here in Clayton, and I called him up and he says, drop up to the house on Saturday morning. And on Saturday morning I was there and went into Zenda and was escorted to his desk. And so I was paying my condolences to the passing of Mr. Muldoon, and a doorbell rang and a gentleman came in, was introduced as an insurance man, and Mr. Youngs said to this insurance man, do you know Bob Kittle? And we didn't know one another, and Mr. Youngs says, well, he's my new farm manager. And I kind of sat back, and they did some business, and after we got through, I said to him, Mr. Youngs, I said, I think you're taking a lot for granted. I said, I really don't know much about your business. And in being the nature that he was, he said, well, God damn it. He says, you graduated from Cornell, you must have learned something. So I'll have someone pick you up and move your furniture. So that was that. Sadly, he gave me free run just like he did Mr. Youngs, or Mr. Muldoon, gave free run of management. And the only time he asked me to consult him was when we bought machinery. And it was interesting, we'd gather up our bills and had to have all the bills in the mail on Monday morning, and they went into the office in New York and they were all paid by Thursday, and it was a great business relationship. The sad part was Mr. Youngs died in the fall, in October, and so our relationship was short. When I took over the job, there were many projects that were going on at the farm, and Mr. Muldoon had worked closely with Cornell in doing some basic research along the lines of artificial insemination of beef cattle, which beef cattle aren't, it isn't easy to, versus a dairy animal. Dairy animals are in the barn and they're easy to collect them and do the breeding project. But the project was to get a large number of animals to come into estrus all at the same time, so that a person could come in and breed a large number. And it took a long time to get this worked out, but I can say today, which is 60 plus years later, it is a going practice for not only beef cattle, but for dairy cattle, especially with our farmers that have got large numbers of dairy heifers, like the numbers now. Probably at that time, the farm was at its peak. Mr. Youngs died. He had two basic heirs to his estate, his wife and a gentleman by the name of Mr. John McFarland. John really had no interest in the farms, and but we were good friends, and so there were many decisions made just what to do with the farms. And like Mr. Young's, we talked very, very little business. I bet you John and I had not talked business probably an hour in our whole lifetime, because it was one time I went to New York we were having a very dry spell in the spring of the year, and I knew that we either had to sell cattle or buy more land, and so I was to meet John at his boat, which I did, and we went boating. And I came away from New York knowing less than I did when I went there. And it really was Mr. Young's intent, and I'm jumping around here a little, but it was he sent me a confidential letter when I first got his employment as to what we would do at the farm, and as to try to not necessarily make money, but to break even. And he had it all outlined, and the way we were going to break even was get bigger. And he told me to go out and buy all the land that I could buy, and we worked towards, well, at the time we had 800 cattle and worked to over 1,000. And so that all went by the wayside when he passed away. But the decision with what to do with the land was I guess I made the decision, and I told John that he was also interested in not losing money, naturally. And I said, well, I think that I can break even if we keep the island and the mainland farm, and sell the rest of the property, get rid of the rest of the property. And that basically is just what happened. The farms were sold, all the mainland farms were sold, except I'm trying to think of what year that was. But anyway, this it was sold to a gentleman by the name of Roger Mead, and he was going to develop it, but he never did. The main house at the Zenda, that was sold to St. Regis Paper Company, and St. Regis Paper Company used it as a place to entertain, and then St. Regis later on sold it to Champion Paper Company. The Zenda itself burned in I think 1990, but well, it burned in somewhere. My notes are bad here, Bob. Oh, 1991 it burned, and the company, as I said earlier, we were at our peak in probably 1960, something like that, and we gradually got out of the beef cattle business. And the farmland, we basically just pastured and cut the hay, and then John decided to sell the island, and that was sold to Patton Corporation in 1986, and I forget what the sale price was, but that was around $700,000 or $800,000, and that was a relatively reasonable price. In 1997, My part of the farm, I was getting gradually less and less, and I was asked to get into the employment of the company, Young's Drug Company, and the farm was basically laid dormant for many years, and finally there was a transfer. John made a transfer or a gift to the Thousand Island Land Trust, which has done a great job in stewarding and preserving the land and the buildings, and a lot of that credit goes to Sissy Danforth, Bill Danforth's wife, and Sissy really, the farm was in dire need of painting, and she see to it that the farm, the buildings were painted, and today that was in probably 98 that the buildings were painted, and the buildings have just been repainted. Today the farm is being used for educational reasons, and they have a community garden there. There's a trail walk, and it's really great that the farm is being used as it is. In probably completion here, I want to thank the Thousand Island Museum for giving me the opportunity, and its staff for making the presentation at History at Noon, and also to Dan Throop for his time and efforts in the recording of this. So thank you very much. I missed some stuff, but